The NCAA pulled in $1.38 billion last year, while operating as a registered nonprofit, which means they paid zero corporate taxes and had no shareholders to answer to. While this was happening, their CEO Charlie Baker collected a salary that rivals what Fortune 500 executives make, all while the organization spent decades telling athletes they couldn't earn a single dime off their own names. But here's the thing you need to understand. This isn't just another story about hypocrisy or unfair rules. It is actually a story about liquidation, and the group doing the dismantling isn't some outside competitor, but rather the NCAA's own most valuable members who are quietly breaking the structure apart from the inside. When one single tournament generates over $1 billion in broadcast rights in 1 year, which happened for the first time recently with March Madness, you stop being a governing body and you become an asset. Assets in the business world get acquired, stripped down, and redistributed among the winners. And if you stick around, I will show you exactly how that is happening right now. Let's start with the dirty secret. The NCAA never mentions in its fancy press releases. March Madness generates somewhere between 65 and 70% of every dollar the NCAA brings in. Meaning if you take away those 3 weeks of basketball, the entire organization would collapse by tomorrow morning. The offices would lock their doors and the money would stop moving because the whole machine relies on just one product to survive. To understand why this is a problem, you have to look at how the money actually flows through the system. Total NCAA revenue sits at roughly $1.38 billion. And out of that massive pile, broadcast rights from the men's tournament alone hit a record $1.02 billion for the 2026 event. That money feeds into a distribution waterfall where about $800 million flows down to Division I schools and conferences, which then pass it along based on a unit system tied to how many games a team wins. On paper, that system sounds like a fair way to reward success, but in reality, it creates a massive gap between the rich and the poor. The SEC collected a record $26 million from tournament performance in 2025 alone, while a smaller mid-major school that loses in the first round might only see units worth about $350,000 per year. When you realize that small check is spread out over 6 years, it stops looking like a real revenue stream and starts looking like a tiny consolation prize. Now think about what the nonprofit label actually does for this business. The NCAA holds tax-exempt status on over $1.5 billion in revenue, allowing them to skip corporate taxes while their senior executives pull in multi-million-dollar salaries. They justify those paychecks as reasonable compensation for running what is basically one of the largest sports media operations in America. For decades, that charity label acted like a shield that helped the whole system avoid the kind of intense scrutiny a for-profit business would have faced on day one. The best way to describe this is like the Netflix model, but flipped completely in reverse. While Netflix owns a platform and pays to license content, the NCAA is a situation where the content actually owns the platform. March Madness has become so incredibly valuable that the NCAA itself is now expendable, and the people who realized this first weren't the fans or the media. The real players were the athletic directors and conference commissioners who realized they didn't need a middleman anymore, and once they saw they could keep the money for themselves, the clock started ticking. So who actually controls the future of March Madness, and what happens when the people who create the content decide they are done with the distributor? That question gets answered very quickly when you look at the massive power play the Big Ten and SEC have been quietly building behind the scenes. If you want the clearest proof that we're watching a total liquidation and not just a simple realignment, you only have to look at what happened to the Pac-12 between 2022 and 2024. Back in 2022, USC and UCLA dropped a bombshell by announcing they were jumping ship for the Big Ten. And let's be clear, they didn't do it for the love of the game or better competition. They did it for a slice of a massive $1.1 billion annual media pie, which triggered a domino effect that saw Oregon and Washington follow them out the door in 2023. Within just 24 months, a conference that had stood for over a century and housed some of the most iconic brands in sports history basically vanished into thin air. Stanford and Cal were forced to join the ACC, while Oregon State and Washington State were left fighting for their lives, proving the whole thing evaporated just to chase TV money. That isn't realignment, it's asset extraction. When you look at the Big Ten deal in plain numbers, the scale is almost hard to wrap your head around. We are talking about a 7-year contract worth between $7 and $8 billion total, which averages out to roughly $1.1 billion every single year, split between Fox, NBC, and Paramount. Ohio State and Michigan are now pulling in about $80 million annually just from their broadcast checks, and that isn't just a line item in a budget. That is an operational floor that most mid-major programs will never see in their entire existence, no matter how hard they work or how many games they win. The SEC didn't just sit back and watch. They countered by locking in a $3 billion deal with ESPN that generates at least $72 million for every legacy school every year. When you put these two conferences together, you have a duopoly that controls over 70% of all college football revenue, and all that cash is concentrated in about 30 schools out of more than 350 Division I programs. These aren't athletic departments anymore. They are standalone media conglomerates that just happen to field sports teams on the weekends. The NCAA is now just a regulatory body they still technically report to for the time being, but even that relationship is hanging by a thread. This is where the idea of subsidized failure becomes really important for us to understand. Historically, the massive programs help pay for the smaller ones through NCAA distributions, because the logic was that you needed opponents to fill a schedule and keep the whole ecosystem alive. But the new media reality has broken that logic completely because networks don't pay for parity, they pay for premium inventory. A matchup between Ohio State and Michigan prints money for everyone involved, but Ohio State playing a Sunbelt team simply does not move the needle. The Giants are now using their tax-exempt status and conference leverage to force smaller schools to cover the overhead while they keep the premium profits for themselves. It looks exactly like a private equity roll-up where a firm acquires the valuable assets, strips away the costs, and then discards the units that aren't performing. The revenue gap is widening much faster than anyone projected, and when one group of schools has an $80 million media rights advantage over everyone else, competitive balance doesn't just erode, it collapses. The Big Ten and SEC are already projecting a combined $10.5 billion in rights revenue by 2036, while the ACC and Big 12 aren't even in that conversation. But here's the twist. The real kill shot isn't actually the media deals. It's buried deep in the fine print of a class action lawsuit that just rewired how every single dollar in college sports gets distributed. The media tried to paint the House Veer NCAA settlement as a massive win for the athletes, and on the surface, it definitely looks like one. But if you actually read the financial mechanics of the deal, it's the liquidation event the Power 2 conferences have been waiting for this whole time. The settlement requires the NCAA and its member conferences to pay out $2.8 billion in back damages to former athletes over the next 10 years. On top of that, starting in the 2025-26 season, schools are allowed to share up to $20.5 million annually directly with their athletes, and that number is scheduled to rise by about 4% every year. Now here's the trap that most people are missing. Schools like Texas, Ohio State, and Georgia can absorb a $20.5 million expense without even blinking, because that's roughly what they already spend just to buy out a failed coaching staff. For the elite programs, this is just the cost of doing business in a new era. But for a mid-major school in the Sun Belt or the MAC, that same number represents their entire operating budget. The settlement didn't actually level the playing field. It set a financial floor that 80% of Division I schools simply cannot meet. And it gets even worse for the little guys. The 27 non-power conferences are on the hook for roughly $990 million of that $2.8 billion debt through reduced NCAA distributions, which means the small schools are literally helping pay for a settlement that primarily benefits the schools that were already winning. Programs are already cutting sports and dropping scholarships while facing potential division downgrades because they can't keep up with the bill. Then you have the NIL loophole that makes that $20.5 million cap almost meaningless for the teams at the very top. Texas is running a $22 million NIL operation, and Ohio State has a $20 million war chest, and both of those operate entirely outside the athletic department budget. This means the richest schools can always find a legal way to exceed the cap, creating a salary cap with no real ceiling for the teams that matter most. Now that the blood is in the water, private equity firms like Redbird Capital and Sixth Street are starting to circle. They are targeting programs that have high brand loyalty but serious cash flow problems, and there are plenty of those to go around right now. The moment a university sells a stake in its athletic department to a private equity firm, the amateur model is legally dead because those firms don't invest in traditions, they only invest in returns. So let's close the loop on this. The nonprofit label protected the profits of elite conferences for decades by avoiding corporate taxes and public accountability on executive pay. Now the courts are forcing a total liquidation of the amateur model, and the smaller schools are stuck footing the $2.8 billion bill, while the giants quietly build the Super League they've always wanted. The NCAA isn't falling apart because of bad luck or simple mistakes, but rather because its most powerful members are stripping it for parts and using this new settlement to finish the job. If you want to build a career inside this massive shift, instead of just watching from the sidelines, you need to look at the roles that are actually paying right now. Power conference compliance officers, athletic department CFOs who can handle the new revenue share math, and NIL collective operators are all in high demand. You should consider starting at a mid-major compliance office where they are desperate for help, because seeing that financial squeeze up close gives you the perfect leverage to jump to a power conference in 3 to 5 years. Drop your dream role in the comments below. If you want to see exactly how that massive $8 billion Big Ten media deal actually works, stick around because that breakdown is coming up next.